I'm Jim Schaefer, the producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Daniel Rothenberg, who's here to discuss his book, With These Hands, The Hidden World of Migrant Farm Workers Today. Daniel, welcome to the show. As the title of your book suggests, migrant farm workers are indeed still people who are, for the most part, invisible or hidden from the view of most people in America, if not the world. How did your interest in them develop and then extend even to the point of scholarly study?
Well, thanks very much for having me on the program. I first got involved working with migrant farm workers when I took a job as an outreach worker and paralegal for legal services, a federally funded legal services program in rural Florida. And I took the job knowing not all that much about farm workers. And I was surprised and amazed by what I found, both the conditions, the fact that the conditions that farm workers live and work under are often so in such marked contrast to what we expect from a job in the United States. You know, decent pay, fair wages, decent working conditions, et cetera. And at the most extreme levels, what I found were conditions that were actually amazing to encounter. And I also found that workers' stories and workers' voices and workers' lives were compelling and engaging and interesting in a way that merited some presentation in the larger world. And I went out and looked for books and basically discovered that there wasn't something that did exactly what I thought ought to be done, and I decided that I would write a book.
So what is your interest in the scholarly part now?
Well, you know, I actually had this job before I entered graduate school. And so, in fact, I wrote the book while I was in graduate school, you know, doing academic work and taking my exams and writing my dissertation and all that sort of thing. And in fact, the book is quite distinct from most of the academic work I do, although I do a fair amount of work related to migration issues and migration theory, which is an expanding element of you know, sociological theory. And now I teach immigration and other issues at University of California at Irvine, and so there's a direct relationship between the work I did as an advocate, the work I didn't write in the book, and then the academic work I do today.
As you point out in your book, there's no question that the hands of the people, with these hands, part excuse me, who help bring lettuce and grapes to the tables in our homes belong to people who quite legitimately could be called an underclass. How do you think this has happened, and will it continue into the present?
Well, just to take off on this idea of the hands, I mean, the book is called With These Hands, and the idea of the title and the point of the book is to try to connect ordinary Americans to these socially invisible people, farm workers, and also this larger social world of farm labor, because the book includes not only the voices of farm workers, but also of their employers, contractors, growers, U.S. Border Patrol officials who try to keep people from crossing the border, coyotes who help smuggle people across the border, lobbyists for agricultural interests, migrant advocates, physicians who work with farm workers, migrant children, and a long list of different people whose lives brought together help tell the tale of this social world. So the theme of hands, or the title With These Hands, the point is to try to sort of link in a very visceral and direct way this weave of different lives to all American consumers who go to the store and pick out with their own hands cantaloupe, lettuce, any kind of fruit or vegetable, and then take that home and consume it, et cetera. And quite often the last hand that touched that piece of produce, that fruit, was the hand of a farm worker. And there's a link that's very direct, and yet at the same time there's an enormous distance, both geographical and then in particular social, that makes it hard to see farm workers, that makes farm workers socially invisible. And so the point is to try to link, through the text of the book, ordinary people to farm workers, which sort of answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's very effective. And there's been, different times in the recent past with Cesar Chavez and grape boycotts, but it seems also that seems a little dimmer than what it has been now. At least it seems like somewhat dimmer, and people have started perhaps not addressing those issues as much as they did before.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no question that farm workers rose to issues of farm workers became a national concern with the rise of the United Farm Workers Union, and in particular with the work of Cesar Chavez. Now unions there's a whole chapter dedicated to unionization and farm workers, and it's a very interesting issue because the union rose at a time in direct relationship to the civil rights movement and to a whole series of changes in the United States where attention was drawn to the struggles of minorities in particular, first African Americans in the South, and then Cesar Chavez became the first sort of national leader for Latinos. But one of the most interesting things about farm worker unions is that on the one hand they've ended up not achieving the goals they attempted to, whereas at the same time they have achieved a number of fairly extraordinary goals given the struggle, given the forces they had to struggle against. Although a story that's sort of not known hardly at all is the story of unionization in Hawaii. In fact, Hawaiian farm workers so successfully unionized that the conditions of farm laborers in Hawaii are so much better than the conditions for farm workers in the rest of the country that they're rarely even looked at as farm workers at all. They're just people who have jobs on farms. Because the farm workers that this book focuses on are essentially the poorest and most disadvantaged of workers in the country. And to get to the previous question, have been in that status for a very long time. I mean, the United States has consistently employed the most vulnerable people in the country to be farm laborers. Typically recent immigrants and immigrants who for one reason or another had few other options. The very earliest farm laborers in a sort of agribusiness sense were Chinese workers in California who had few other options, which were followed by Japanese workers, Filipino workers. Now we see a farm labor force that's largely Latino, especially Mexican workers. In the rural South, in particular, the farm labor force was largely African American workers. And the time when there were enormous numbers of white workers in the fields is linked to the Great Depression in particular.
What do you think of the dynamics, why the migrant workers are so invisible or hidden from, in this way?
Well, there's several different components to the whole farm labor story that make farm work both distinct in terms of its labor and distinct in terms of its history. So the labor elements that are special are, it's a seasonal job. So it's, there's a need for labor for relatively short periods of time in a very intense way. So that's a fundamentally difficult situation. You need to have laborers somewhere, but not for very long. So that makes it hard for workers to have a stable life. What's interesting about farm labor is that is the hand harvest. The majority of farm workers work in hand harvesting fruits and vegetables. And virtually all the fruits and vegetables we consume are actually hand harvested, picked by hand from vines, from trees, from plants. Whereas the agribusiness system is extremely technological. From the genetically produced seeds that are used ever more frequently, to the amounts of chemicals and the types of chemicals that are used, to the complex shipping mechanisms, the marketing mechanisms, the tracking mechanisms. Every piece of fruit you buy now has a little code on it, and that code can, at a moment's notice, tell you how many of a particular kind of apple are being sold in that store, in that region, in the country. I mean, the technological innovations in virtually every element of agribusiness are extraordinary, and yet the actual farm labor, the picking, is virtually the same as it's been for centuries. I think that, the conclusion of the book mentions the current status of farm workers as in some ways being an alternate history of American labor, because farm workers were specifically excluded from virtually all of the New Deal era labor protections that transformed what it meant to be a worker in the United States. And when I say that, I mean all of the things that we basically take for granted: minimum wage, child labor protections, Social Security, unemployment insurance, the right the protective rights towards unionization. And most of these protections were then given to farm workers in a piecemeal fashion, typically 25, 30, 40 years after the original exclusion. So farm workers were created as a sort of secondary class of workers for all of these years. So who would take these jobs? Well, people who had few other options. Now, and even to this day, there are specific exclusions only for farm laborers. So that even though farm work is ranked as the second most dangerous job in the United States, there are special rules that allow children as young as 12 to work in the fields. Children who won't be allowed to flip burgers or sell shoes, and certainly won't be allowed in the other dangerous professions such as mining that have higher limits for minimum age. And you have, for example, specific exclusions that allow certain farm workers not to be even paid, for example, not to be paid minimum wage on very small farms, and all farm workers are completely excluded from the overtime protections. So workers who are often working very long hours don't get any overtime, whereas all other workers doing all other kinds of work, in fact, do. And these kinds of, the creation of farm workers as being a special group, both socially but then also legally, has contributed to this world that we're currently in, where farm labor is such a bad job that the average annual salary is around $6,500 a year, a fairly unbelievable amount of money. I mean, that is, by any measure, not much money.
Well, they're also exposed to environmental things like pesticides, and there was some discussion in your book, I think, about that, about the dangers that represents and the extreme exposure.
I mean, there's one story. One of the actual most significant exposures in recent years, the book presents the story of a particular person who was in charge of a small crew, and talks about what happened when these people got poisoned, and just how difficult it was to get the legal recognition for the situation, which was an accidental but completely avoidable mass poisoning of of poor marginalized people. I mean, had this kind of poisoning occurred, say, in a school, let's imagine something completely accidental to a bunch of middle-class kids, it would have made national news, and there would have been a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and things would have happened, legislation would have been passed, et cetera, et cetera. What happened really is the farmer got a fine of around $5,000, and the workers collected minimal worker compensation. There's a small amount of money that they got as a settlement through a workers' compensation case. And it's a sign of just the kind of things that happen so often. I mean, really, in the case of the dangers of pesticides, certain things are known about the dangers of pesticides, many other things are not known. And even though many pesticides, there's a debate whether pesticides can be safely handled, but there's not a lot of, you go out into the real world of real fields and you see how they're actually handled, and quite commonly they're handled in ways that are extraordinarily dangerous. And not only, often by people who really just don't know the dangers that they're facing. And one of the things that was most frightening for the workers in this crew was their discovery that they were always working in an environment that presented dangers that were invisible. Pesticides, particularly because the way that pesticides have particular long-term effects that are hard to grasp. You may get a rash for a week, 2 weeks, that may go away. But there are long-term effects that are poorly understood.
You do have a chapter in your book on debt peonage and migrant workers, and I was sort of fascinated by that. In our previous discussion before this interview, you said that's a rather rare occasion, but also a telling one, and maybe you can discuss that a little bit more.
Sure. Essentially, debt peonage is a circumstance where farm workers, or anybody really, it's most common now in the United States, or almost only exists now in the United States for farm laborers. Although there are a few other kinds of incidences in, say, certain kinds of sweatshops. But basically, debt peonage is a circumstance where, because of the debts that you incur to your employer, you're held in a state where you earn no wages for your work because all of your wages go towards paying debts that you've incurred, often through kind of questionable and abusive means. And typically, as in the case of most of these farm labor crews, there's also the threat of violence and the use of real violence to intimidate workers. And debt peonage was actually the norm for many African-American crews from the 40s through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s, up through the 90s, although it's disappearing for several reasons, partly because African-American farm workers are simply disappearing as a group. They're being rapidly replaced by Latino workers at such a rate that I've seen in my fairly short historical dealings with farm workers an incredible shift. When I first started working in Florida in 1990, there were all kinds of African-American crews all over the place, many of whom were held in conditions of debt peonage. Now, many of those crews have gone out of business simply because they can't compete with the new influx of Latino workers to the South. But the reason debt peonage is so important is, one, it's certainly the most shocking condition found for any laborers anywhere in the United States. And the conditions are so extreme that employers of farm workers who hold them in debt peonage have been convicted of enslaving their workers. There are people in jail today for having enslaved workers in the United States, which is extraordinary, I mean, by any measure, I think. And even though debt peonage is not at all common, it's important to focus on because it's such both an extreme example, shows just how bad things can get in the farm labor world, and also because it was such a key component of the historical experience of African American farm workers.
How do they exist if all their money is, they're not getting any income?
Oh, they get fed by they
get
live on a
fed.
labor camp. Labor camps typically in some isolated area, although I know of labor camps where people are held in debt peonage that are a stone's throw away from condominiums and multiplex cinemas.
Well,
This
that's
is fairly
really
amazing.
ironic, yeah.
And I mean, they're amazing places, but to get into the camp, some camps are surrounded by fences. That used to be very typical. That's somewhat less typical now. But what is typical is that the crew leaders who run these camps have guards and tough guys, essentially, who are often armed, who police the camp and prevent people from leaving. And workers who get on the camp are usually, I mean, the key component of this is that they're usually alcoholics or people who use a lot of drugs, particularly crack now. It used to be only alcohol, but now that crack has sort of entered the farm labor world, there's a whole world, there's a kind of a subgroup of crews of people who are addicted to crack, and they essentially work for crack. And they're typically picked up in homeless shelters in major cities. So often they're not even people with much experience doing farm labor or much experience in rural America. Another thing that's very important about the whole institution of debt peonage is that it shows the relationship between contractors, who are the middlemen between workers and growers. And the worst abuses are usually committed by the contractors. And contractors are often used as a way, by growers, as a way of insulating themselves both from the sense of personal responsibility and connection to workers, and also the legal liability for the conditions in which workers are living and working. And the contractor system is central to just how bad conditions are in farm work today and have been for years. And one thing that we see now in America that's very interesting is the explosion of contracting systems throughout the economy, for janitorial service, for all kinds of temporary labor service. And people who work for contractors and subcontractors can very easily be treated worse, and they can be hired by quite reputable companies who avoid their legal responsibilities for these workers and also avoid the administrative responsibilities and all kinds of responsibilities by hiring contractors, subcontractors, layers of contractors. In other words, it encourages a kind of say, a black market or a sort of a hidden world. And part of the title, the hidden world of farm workers, one reason why it's hidden is the use of contractors that isolate workers from the growers.
So it produces sort of a depth of, or a distance between those who are doing the work and those that are receiving the benefit of the work.
Oftentimes. Now, but another thing that I worked very hard in this book to not just make it a book about a bad economic system that presents growers as, say, bad actors. I mean, there's a whole chapter on growers, and I talked at great length to quite a lot of growers, and they come out as people working hard to do a very important job, which is producing food. And what you see happening in the world of agriculture is something you see throughout the economy, which is it's increasingly difficult to function as a small unit. So family farmers, who actually often had very close and personal relationships with their workers, are going out of business throughout the country because they simply can't compete with the large agribusiness interests that produce the vast majority of our fruits and vegetables and are producing more and more, higher and higher percentage of the fruits and vegetables we consume. And the larger entities, can't have that personal relationship with workers because they hire thousands of them at times.
That's a good point. Many people may not be aware that, as you observe in the book, many of the migrant farm workers are enduring some of these conditions as an attempt to help their families back home survive on the ranchos in Mexico. Could you discuss the implications of this, both for migrant farm workers and for those back in the communities?
Sure. I mean, one of the way things have developed in the United States, now the vast majority of the farm workers in our country are immigrants, recent immigrants. And many of them travel back and forth from Mexico because, again, the vast majority of those immigrants are Mexican immigrants. They travel back and forth from Mexico to the United States. And the seasonality of farm labor allows them to return to their home communities periodically. And so you have a whole world of towns, ranchos as they're called, rural communities throughout particularly central western Mexico that have no men in them for most of the year. And they're amazing places to visit because you go into these communities, and often they show the signs of significant development, large houses, satellite dishes on the roofs of their houses, cars, often new cars, because the money that people earn in the United States is when brought to Mexico, counts for significantly more. And many communities have gone from being quite poor to less poor. But what they've also created is a sort of social world of migration where the towns are full of women, older people, and children for most of the year. And so you enter these towns and they have a kind of a quality of waiting about them, a kind of deadness, a sense of emptiness and loss. And even the most casual conversation with someone in a community like that about these issues brings out very powerfully a life that is lived with a constant waiting, a constant distance between the families and the workers in the United States. And it's a profound thing to see, and it's important for Americans to recognize that this world exists, because part of the story of immigration in the United States and part of the story of farm labor is the story of all of these families that rely on the wages that farm workers earn and yet live in a distant country and live this experience of migration, but again, from a distance and through the absence of the men that are doing the labor.
It also gives a different dimension so that you don't think of the migrant workers as just a nomadic group that just keeps going around and is not interested in having roots. They have roots, but they're doing this in order to get the money from their work.
I mean, one thing growers say over and over again that's really important to recognize is anybody involved in agriculture, especially growers, are always talking about, recognizing just how extraordinary are the sacrifices of farm laborers. I mean, they really put up with quite a lot of difficulty to provide a better life for their families and work very hard under adverse conditions to make life better. Particularly, they're always thinking about their children. And the qualities that farm workers bring, the sort of the fundamental dignity that labor signifies for these workers is something that's striking if you spend any amount of time with them. And the book is about that. And I think many players in the larger world of farm labor recognize that. The growers recognize that. Even Border Patrol agents quite often recognize that when they're stopping people from crossing. They experience the pain of actually preventing people from realizing a better life. Workers certainly recognize that. Workers' families recognize that. And it would be good for all Americans to recognize that, because it both broadens our understanding of our own economic system, and also I think helps people grasp just what people go through to become immigrants, particularly when they're undocumented immigrants in the United States.
Well, one of the interesting things about your book is just how many of these interviews you've done and the wide variety, like you were talking about. There's young and old and people in all different kinds of roles with this, but the voices are memorable as you're talking with these people on a range of topics. The other thing we were talking about is the services that with migrant workers and the context of the conditions that they face, and I thought maybe you could talk about that a little bit. We were talking about the services for education, health, legal problems, but it's not necessarily an issue of how adequate they are, it's the issue of the overall structure.
Yeah, I think that, one of the most interesting, farm workers are a very interesting case study for many things. I mentioned before that farm workers can be understood as a sort of alternate history of laborers in the United States. They were denied basic fundamental protections for decades. Then, when there began to be an interest in sort of addressing the plight of the farm worker, essentially in the 1960s, along with a whole series of other shifts in U.S. politics, where various interests, various civil rights issues were being discussed, fundamental questions of poverty were being discussed, and there was a vision that the United States government should take on social conditions and eradicate the most troubling conditions in the United States. So interest began being focused on farm workers, particularly farm worker health, farm worker education, and different programs to help sort of this very marginalized group improve their lives. Now, none of those programs altered in any way the fundamental structure of the farm labor system. And those programs grew in expense, in size, and capacity. And now, each year, the United States government spends roughly $600 million a year on farm worker-related programs, the largest being, the largest being migrant education and then migrant health and various programs. Now, the programs are successful in certain respects. They provide much-needed services to people who certainly deserve them, but they haven't altered the structure in a way that, I mean, the conditions of, in a sense, providing these services, well, let me put it this way. Other workers who do important labor for the United States don't have these programs because essentially they don't generally need them. People who travel for a living like truck drivers, there's no special education program for the children of truck drivers because in theory they make enough money so that their children can live a good life. The problem with migrant farm workers is so many elements of their experience involve their own disempowerment and marginalization that these programs are ways to kind of reduce the effects of that without changing the fundamental structure. So that isn't actually a criticism of the programs themselves, but it is kind of a test case in a way of looking at what a government program can and cannot do when it doesn't alter the fundamental structure of a system.
What are the global implications of this issue? I think we started talking about that a little bit, but especially with American markets and supermarkets buying fruits and vegetables from other countries, including Peru, Spain, Chile. It seems like that's also part of the larger group of workers supplying these fruits and vegetables with their hands for our consumption.
I mean, one of the points of the book has a lot of sort of larger points that are sort of interspersed in these very concrete personal narratives. And one of the larger points is just to draw attention to the fundamental invisibility of production that is gaining increasing importance in our lives. More and more things are being made farther and farther away from our worlds, both in a geographical sense, like in other countries, and in a social sense, in that there's a growing distinction between people who labor with their hands and people who labor in other ways, in the service profession, in information technology, et cetera. And farm workers stand out in our society because they work with their hands, and no machine as of yet has been developed to replace them. So long as there are farms producing fruits and vegetables in the United States, we're going to have farm workers laboring with their hands. And yet, the labor they're doing is in fact quite similar to the labor being done in these other countries that you mentioned and throughout the world, and not all that dissimilar in some ways from the labor that goes into, the hand labor that goes into making our clothing, the hand labor that goes into all sorts of production that allows us to live such a very, very good life. In the United States, we have an enormous, we benefit from the enormous, extraordinary availability of things. And yet, the histories of those things, the productive histories, the fact that people labor to make those things possible in our lives is invisible to us in countless ways. And part of the larger arguments of the book is to reveal this hidden world that's right around us. It's in our country, and farm workers are, in fact, not that far from where we're sitting today. But actually, the larger point is that many things are linked to invisible productive worlds. In fact, almost all of the things that we consume and purchase and use to make our lives so full.